Would the strategy have sounded plausible as a response to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor? Imagine that following Pearl Harbor, Americans were told that victory would come not by fighting the enemy until its unconditional surrender. No, but by bringing democracy to Asia and Europe. Imagine that our goal in the war was declared to be liberating poor Japanese and Germans from enslavement by their rulers. Imagine that U.S. bombers dropped aid packages on German and Japanese cities in between delicate sprinkles of missiles. Because this was not the approach taken, World War II was won decisively in less than 4 years after Pearl Harbor. We are now entering the 6th year of Bush's war, and there is no end in sight. Things are only getting worse. After Pearl Harbor, the outraged people of America demanded self-assertive retaliation, and their government delivered. Likewise, right after 9/11, people were righteously outraged. Their healthy, rational response was, we need to fight a war now to make us safer. The administration also felt outraged. It famously announced that we must, quote, end states who support terrorism, unquote. The original name of the military campaign in Afghanistan was aptly chosen, Operation Infinite Justice, signaling that it was proper for America to assert its own interests, proper for us to defend ourselves. Put into words, the mood came to this. It was America's moral right to defend itself, to secure its own interests. But that initial response to 9/11 did not last. It was not translated into any military strategy for victory. The idea that it is right for America to be self-interested, that did not last. Operation Infinite Justice was renamed to something blandly differential. The nation's willingness to defeat the enemy evaporated. Why? Because the initial response that self-interest is proper clashed with people's more deeply held belief about what is morally good. This is where the forward strategy comes in. This strategy reflects and is motivated by the dominant moral code in our country, altruism. From secular and religious authorities, left and right, we are urged that to be moral is to give up your values in selfless service to others. We hear it constantly. Serve in a cause larger than yourself, and whatever you do, don't be selfish. According to this creed, our duty is to put other people first and subordinate or renounce our own values. According to this creed, Mother Teresa is a moral hero, but a productive businessman like Bill Gates is not. Unless, of course, he repents and gives away his billions of dollars. Whom must we serve? Well, whoever is deemed needy, whoever lacks a value, like liberty or wealth. And on this standard, the oppressed, impoverished, primitive Iraqis are definitely have-nots. Although bringing them democracy would be hard, Bush said, quote, that is no excuse to leave the Iraqi regime's torture chambers and poison labs in operation, unquote. Why? Because as Bush stated, we Americans know how to, quote, sacrifice for the liberty of strangers, unquote. Now, it is important to understand Bush's statement precisely. The goal of the democracy crusade is not to end the threats arrayed against us, but to bring unearned benefits to the world's hungry and oppressed. Facing catastrophic threats to the lives of Americans, how did the administration respond? Well, guided by its moral premises, the administration did not ask itself what must be done to protect the country. Instead, it asked, how can America best serve strangers in need. The forward strategy is not concerned with defeating the enemy at all. It is a substitute for achieving victory. And that is exactly how Washington directed the entire war. From the outset, the war was pitched as a war of liberation. Just as we toppled the Taliban to liberate the Afghans, so we toppled Saddam to liberate the Iraqis. The campaign in Iraq, after all, was called Operation Iraqi Freedom, not American security. Shock and awe, the supposedly merciless bombing of Baghdad, never materialized. That's because, as Washington demanded, the military's goal was not to devastate Iraq's infrastructure, but to provide welfare services. Bush had promised that America will, quote, stand ready to help the citizens of a liberated Iraq. We will deliver medicine to the sick, and we are now moving into place nearly 3 million emergency rations to feed the hungry, unquote. The fighting had hardly begun when Washington launched the so-called Reconstruction. Our military was ordered to commit troops and resources, which were needed to defend military personnel, to the tasks of reopening schools, printing textbooks, fixing up hospitals. For the Iraqis, Washington laid on food and medicine, schools and sewers, but of course at the same time, it tied the hands of its own military. Washington commanded the military to tiptoe around Iraq. Troops were coached in all sorts of cultural sensitivity training so that they would not offend the primitive customs of the locals. The military had to avoid treading in holy shrines in order not to bomb high-priority targets such as power stations. The welfare of Iraqis was placed above the lives of our soldiers. These soldiers who were put in line of fire, but prevented from using all necessary force in order to protect themselves and win the war. Many of our servicemen died as a result. Washington treats the lives of our military personnel as expendable. Their blood is spilt for the sake of serving Iraqis, a people overwhelmingly hostile to America. Bush had committed America to the selfless mission in the run-up to the war. Speaking early in 2003, he said, quote, "The first to benefit from a free Iraq would be the Iraqi people themselves. They live in scarcity and fear under a dictator who has brought them nothing but war and misery and torture. Their lives and their freedom matter little to Saddam Hussein. But Iraqi lives and freedom matter greatly to us," unquote. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops have fought in the wars since 9/11. In Iraq, at the peak, as many as 300,000 of our military were involved. Today, about 140,000 troops are stuck in the quagmire that exists there today. The war effort since 9/11 has cost us about $368 billion, with Iraq costing $261 billion. About 2,600 brave Americans have come home dead in body bags. Nearly 20,000 have come home burned, blinded, limping. They are returning wounded, both physically and psychologically. The casualties of the war are largely unseen, but they are real. And for what? Contemplate what advocates of American destiny are calling for. It is not just one nightmare like Iraq, which is horrendous in itself, but dozens of conflicts that grind up American men and women and drain the lifeblood from our civilization. And not for a few months, but indefinitely, as we fulfill the open-ended calling of our time. Now, this is morally obscene.